Hello and welcome to second edition of Video Church for State Line. We've made some changes for this week thanks to my beautiful technical assistant by the name of Sally. We're using some of her equipment, so appreciate that. So just want to encourage you to get your coffee and we'll get ready to go. Ben, just wanted you to know I'm using my new hanging rock cup. Thank you very much for that. And we're going to go ahead, excuse me, since I have it, I don't want to waste it. We're going to go ahead and talk some more about our theme, miraculous. Now, let me tell you where we're going this morning with this. You all know, as well as I do, that we have a whole lot of things that have just altered life. Again, you know, we've extended through the end of May now, the distancing. You know, school has basically been done for the rest of this year. We're all back to the e-learning, to the homeschooling aspect of it. Travel is limited. You know, I had to go do a blood draw this morning. This is Friday afternoon when I'm recording this. And as soon as I walked into the doors of HOI, the office of my oncologist, there were nurses there taking my temperature to make sure I did not have one. And then when I got upstairs, you know, the first question is, do I have a cough? And it's like, yes, I do, from the allergies, so I had to wear a mask the whole time. I mean, a lot of things are being altered right now. But what is not going to be altered for me, and I pray it's true for you, is the fact of my reflecting and my remembering the fact that we are in the Easter celebration season. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm going to miss the fact that we're not going to be able to do the reenactment again this year on Thursday night. I'm going to miss the Good Friday service. But I am not going to miss reflecting on and remembering Easter. All of it, from the cross to the resurrection. Wednesday morning, when I was doing my devotions, I was reading in the first part of 1 Corinthians, in the first chapter, and thinking about this sermon. I found myself just kind of stopped in the tracks on verse 17, where Paul talks about the power in the cross. And I reflected on some things that we've been dealing with in this miraculous series. I reflected on some of the fact that, sorry about that, my technical assistant's phone just went off. So anyhow, I was reflecting on the fact of how that John talks so much about the cross being Jesus' hour. The fact that that's why he came. That's the power in the cross. When I think about the power in the cross, I reflect upon what Paul says in Philippians 2 and how that Jesus went to the cross in obedience to God's will for him as he went to the cross to deal with sin, my sin and your sin. When I think of the power in the cross, I reflect upon Paul's words in Colossians that alludes to the fact that when Jesus went to the cross, he went to that cross canceling, paying the debt that I had against God because of my sin. And Jesus goes to the cross and he hangs that debt on the cross, and it's canceled because of his death. That's the power in the cross. It's the power in the cross that just brings to my mind that great line from that Crowder song, you know, a cross meant to kill is my victory. And just as the miraculous surrounds the life of Jesus, there is also the miraculous in the cross. And when you look at the cross through the lens of the miraculous, what you see are some miracles at Calvary. And so for a few minutes right now, I just want us to explore. I want us to think about the miracles at Calvary And I want to do that as we look at this passage in Matthew. I'm in Matthew 27 this morning. I'm going to read verses 45 through 54. And I want you to hear these words, and I want you to look at what's going on here through the lens of the miraculous. So let me read what Matthew writes. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. And that is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, this man is calling Elijah. And one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and gave it to Jesus to drink. But the other said, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were open, and many of the bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe. And they said, truly, this was the Son of God. So I want to explore with you 6 miracles at Calvary. So if you need to, go fill up your coffee. Let's get ready to explore together. The first miracle that I want us to explore is what I'm calling the miracle of darkness. And it's what you see taking place there in that 45th verse. Jesus is nailed to the cross at 9 a.m. There's a sound of hammers and nails. There's screams of pain. There's the oozing, dripping blood from Jesus. There's people talking and laughing and jeering. And for 3 hours, it was like any other crucifixion. But at noon, 12 o'clock, when the sun was at its zenith, there was this astounding miracle that took place, a supernatural miracle that occurred. And suddenly and without warning, darkness fell. In Luke's account of this miracle of darkness, he uses a word eklepo, and the word means to fail utterly. It's as if God just turned the switch and he shut the sun off. In one moment there is brightness and there is light and the sun is shining, and the very next moment there is darkness. And it was a darkness that lasted from noon to 3 p.m. That darkness was a supernatural miracle, and I really believe it came from God to simply intensify all the dismal atmosphere that was already associated with Jesus' death on the cross. That miracle of darkness, it's a commentary from God upon what is taking place at this moment. You see, often in the Old Testament, darkness is associated with judgment. Think back to the plagues. In the plague of darkness, it was judgment that God was bringing upon Egypt. When I think about this darkness, I find very interesting something that the prophet Amos says in chapter 8, verses 9 and 10. Listen to these words. And on that day, declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. And I will turn your feast into mourning and all your songs into lamentation. I will bring sackcloth on every waist and baldness on every head. And I will make it like the mourning for an only son, and the end of it like a bitter day. That darkness that came that day, that miracle of darkness, that supernatural event, it was God's commentary of his judgment that was coming upon his Son when all of his fury is released. Now you put that into perspective with what Isaiah talks about, and you realize that in this moment Jesus was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed, he was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. By his wounds, by his stripes, we're healed. That miracle of darkness, as I said, it was a commentary from God, talking about his judgment upon sin, a judgment that was borne by that innocent, sin-bearing substitute. And it was that miracle of darkness that led to that miracle of separation. Because you have in those next few verses that cry of desolation by Jesus after he's been hanging on the cross already for 6 hours. 6 hours of extreme agony. And Jesus still cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now you have to understand that cry within the entire context of Psalm 22 from which it comes. You see, that psalm begins with a sense of desolation, but it ends with the triumphant vindication of that one who is suffering. In that cry of separation, we see the horror of the world's sin, of our sin upon Jesus. We see the cost of salvation. But there's something almost incomprehensible in this miracle of separation. Have you ever thought these questions? How can God be separated from God? How can the Father be divided from the Son? How can God forsake the Son when they are one in essence? I mean, put it this way. All that Jesus has ever known since before time, in all of eternity, all that he's ever known is intimate communion with the Father. And at this moment, what he is experiencing is something he has never experienced before, and it's hatred from his Father because of sin. Paul reminds us Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. You see, because of Jesus' identification with our sin, because all of our sin is placed upon him, God the Father wrote perfect communion with God the Son and poured upon him the cup of his infinite wrath. Paul reminds us in 2 Corinthians, for our sake God made Jesus to be sin who knew no sin, so that, and those are so important words, so that in Jesus we might become the righteousness of God. An article I read this week quoted from Philippi NZ, and I appreciated what he said. Listen to these words. He says, Jesus is expressing here a grave sense of estrangement, as though some inconceivable split had opened up in the Godhead, the Son feeling abandoned by the Father. He writes, no theologian, and I would add no preacher, but he says no theologian can adequately explain the nature of what took place within the Trinity on that day at Calvary. All we have is a cry of pain from a child who felt forsaken. But here's the miracle. It's because of Jesus' separation that you and I can now be united to him and the Father. There's a third miracle I see here, and that's the miracle of victory. What we're told down in that 50th verse, and Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. The word is kraxis, and it means to scream. So again, keep in mind, it's been 6 hours of torture for Jesus, and yet he is still in complete control of all of his faculties. He didn't just drift off into a coma. He didn't just all of a sudden pass out. He still has the strength to yield up his spirit when the time is right, and to give up his life when he knew it was time to give up his life in victory. He once told his disciples, I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. And he laid it down with a cry. We know from Luke's account that he cried out, my Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. It was a cry of knowing that now the work is done. He now knew that God has been satisfied, and he now yields his spirit into his accepting Father's arms. We know from John that he cried out that great cry, it is finished. One word, tetelestai, and we've been all over that word, but it's the cry of a victor. It is the cry of that man who has completed a task. It is the cry of a victor who has won through his struggles. It is the cry of a victor who's been through darkness, and now he comes out into marvelous light. A cry of victory. Tetelestai, it is finished. You see, the victor is that one who knows, I may feel like I have been separated from the Father, but I have not. He is still here with me. The victor holds on to God, even as Jesus did. And what he experiences is that miracle of victory. And it was that miracle of victory that led to the fourth miracle, the miracle of access, where it says that the temple curtain was torn from top to bottom. You may not know this about this curtain that it's being referred to between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. That curtain was 60 feet long. It was 30 feet high. It was 4 inches thick. It was made up of 72 squares that were sewn together. And it took many, many men to lift it and to put it into place. And it formed a barrier between the Shekinah presence of God in the Holy of Holies and the people. The veil represented a separation between God and us because of sin. Nobody was permitted to pass through that veil into God's presence except the high priest, wearing special garments only on the Day of Atonement, and he had to come into there with the blood of an unblemished goat that he would then sprinkle upon the golden mercy seat. I mean, the whole thing about the curtain, what was God teaching us that we were not acceptable to him because of our sin. I mean, everything about the temple up until this moment talked about people and taught people, you keep your distance. I mean, no one ever just hung out in the holy place. You know, kind of like we hang out in the gathering grounds. No, you came into the holy place, you did God's business, and then you left. And beyond the holy place was the most holy place, where the heart of Jewish worship took place, but only on one day and only by one man. You see, people knew that if anyone besides the high priest ever entered the most holy place, ever went behind that curtain, he was struck down. If the high priest went in there on any other day except the Day of Atonement, he was struck down. And if the high priest went behind that curtain into the most holy place without the blood of a goat, anybody want to guess? He was struck down. But On this day, because of Jesus' perfect sacrifice, God did what only God could do. And he ripped that curtain from top to bottom as a way of saying, now anyone at any time has access to me. And by the way, this was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon during the Passover celebration, and the temple would have been packed with people. And in one moment, the Holy of Holies that no one had ever seen was exposed to everyone's sight. No more Day of Atonement. No more high priest. No more priests. No more sacrifice. No more barrier. The Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 10 records it this way. This begins in verse 19. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Thank God for this miracle of access to him. That leads to a fifth miracle, and that's the miracle of life. And I want to tell you, this miracle is just staggering and overwhelming. Listen to what it said. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Every time I read those two verses, and it's only Matthew who talks about this, my mind shifts into overdrive. Now, what preceded this, again, was an earthquake. And that kind of makes sense. Now, anytime you have an earthquake, business as usual stops. Anytime you have an earthquake, it's a reminder we are not in control. I mean, anytime there's an earthquake, people are seeking some kind of a shelter. One of the scholars I read said maybe that's what's happening here. In this earthquake, it's God's way of saying, stop and look. This is my son who died for you. You need to run to the cross and be saved. That makes sense. But I begin to think of these other events that happen, and my mind just begins to fly around. It says the earthquake splits rocks, and I think, okay, that makes sense. Matthew says that earthquake opened up many tombs. And again, I'm thinking, I understand that. Earthquakes happen. Stones are going to roll away from entrances. But then he goes on to say that many of the saints and many of the believers were raised to life on that Sunday morning after Jesus was raised. And if you're honest, you come to that phrase, you go, what, wait, what? And then he says, they were all strolling through Jerusalem, and many people saw them. And it's kind of like, boom, with what's going on. I'll be very honest with you. And it's, as I said, it's only Matthew who records it. And it's only in those couple of verses, and nothing else is said. But what I do understand about this miracle is the powerful testimony to the death-destroying, life-giving power of Jesus. Because of his life, and because of his death, and because of his resurrection, it's kind of a spoiler alert here, we're going to talk about more of that next Sunday. The tomb and death, it's lost its power. It's lost its terror. And because Jesus lives, we know that we will also live. That's the miracle of life. And last is the miracle of belief. And it may be the greatest miracle, this miracle of belief. And it centers around this centurion who played a very crucial role in the death of Jesus. As a leader of 100 men, he would have been a man held in high esteem. He had a proven military record. He knew how to promptly carry out orders. As a centurion, he had to be an expert with the sword, an expert with other weapons. He was a proven leader of men. But when I think about this centurion, I can't help but wonder, Well, would he have known the centurion whose servant Jesus raised back to life, that he healed in Luke 7? Now, Judea and Galilee, they were small areas. And could it be that these two centurions had crossed paths? And if they did this centurion at the cross know about that other centurion's servant that Jesus had healed? The centurion had no doubt heard Pilate say 3 times that Jesus was innocent of any crimes. And did he wonder, why am I being ordered to kill this man on a cross? This centurion had been there, and for 6 hours he had watched what had happened. He heard what Jesus said at the very beginning, when Jesus said probably what no other person hung on a cross had ever said, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." He had watched how he had died. He had seen him die with power and cry out, "It is finished." And through all of that, he saw what all the priests and all the politicians had missed. They only saw a troublemaker. But the centurion got it. He knew this was the Son of God. And it was the cross that moved him to see the majesty of Jesus. I'm not surprised. Jesus had told his followers earlier, "And when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself." He said earlier in John, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know I am, and that I do nothing of my own authority, but speak just as the Father taught me." There's the power in the cross. It leads to this miracle of belief that just flows from a heart that's really open to the truth. You see, the miracle at Calvary is that the cross represents new life. New life for anyone because sins are forgiven. New life because Jesus went to that cross to pay the debt that none of us can pay. New life where I no longer have to live in guilt. I am no longer separated from God by a barrier, but now because of Jesus, I have a relationship with him. That's the miracle of the cross. And that's why today is a great day to simply allow the reality of who Jesus is and the reality of what he did on that cross to make a difference in your heart. That you come to the place even where that centurion was, and you reflect upon that miracle at Calvary and what you experience and what you live out is that miracle of belief. And you just let that flow from your life. And maybe I'll just say it this way. That you and I, even in such a time as this, live in such a way that our lives really do shout out, "Jesus, you are the Son of God." Let me pray with you. Father, I'm thankful that you still work miracles. I'm thankful for all the miracles that I see at the cross. And I'm grateful we've had the time to simply talk about them together this morning. And Father, I want to pray that in each of our lives, what we really experience today is that miracle of belief. We really do believe with all of our heart that Jesus is the Christ. He is the Son of God. And he came to this earth to be our Savior and to be our Lord. And I pray we know that. I pray we believe that.